It was a horse who refused to take another step. A 14-year-old paint mare, planted on a limestone trail in Big Bend country, ears pinned, hooves locked into the dust, refusing every command her rider gave her. He'd worked her for 11 years. She had never, in all that time, refused him. And on that October morning in 2024, the silence she made felt heavier than any sound, because somewhere behind that wall of pale rock, under the surface of a hill no rancher ever bothered to climb, two girls were dying. Two girls who had been missing for 4 years. And the only thing standing between them and a cave that would have become their grave was one stubborn, gray-flecked mare named Juno, and a tired old cowboy who, for reasons he would never be able to explain, finally listened. Reese Calloway was 56 years old that October, and most people in Brewster County would tell you he was a quiet man. Not unfriendly, just quiet, the way men sometimes become after a marriage ends and a daughter grows up and moves 400 miles away. He leased 4,400 acres west of Alpine, a stretch of high desert and rocky bluff that ran up against the foothills of the Chizos Range. He ran maybe 200 head of mixed beef cattle on it, and he ran them mostly alone. He had a small adobe house at the eastern end of the lease, a barn that had been built in 1962, a Ford that had seen better decades, and a paint mare named Juno who had been his constant working partner since she was 3 years old. His daughter Hannah lived in Austin now, working in a hospital, and they spoke on the phone every Sunday, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for 2. He'd been divorced for 9 years. He had stopped trying to explain that to people. His days had a rhythm to them. He was up at 5, on a horse by 6, in the saddle most days until past sundown. He ate beans and tortillas, and sometimes a piece of steak when his neighbor across the highway slaughtered a heifer. He read paperbacks in the evening by a kerosene lamp, because the electric out at the lease cut out 4 nights out of every 10 in the winter. He owned 3 pairs of boots, 2 hats, 1 good buckle, and a wedding ring that had lived in a drawer beside the bed since the day his wife had handed hers back. He did not feel sorry for himself. He had, in fact, not felt much of anything in particular for a long time. Not unhappy, not happy, just steady. The way a man becomes steady when the things he loves are simple and the things he has lost are old. Juno was a 14-year-old paint, mostly white with patches of brown along her flank and a star on her forehead that had faded with age into a pale, smoky gray. Reese had bought her green and broken her himself, slow and patient, the way his grandfather had taught him. By her 5th year, she was the best cow horse in the county. By her 10th, she was something more than a tool. She knew his moods. She knew when he was tired, and she would shorten her stride. She knew when he was angry, and she would carry herself softer, as if to apologize for whatever she had not done. She had pulled a calf out of a flooded arroyo in 2019. She had carried him 5 miles back to the truck, the year he broke his ankle on a piece of bad shale. She slept standing up in her stall, and she did not spook at thunder, and she did not bite, and she did not kick. She was, in every sense that mattered to Reese Calloway, the second great love of his life. The Hewitt twins had been on the front page of the Big Bend Sentinel 4 years before. He remembered it the way you remember things that happen to other people in towns you drive through. Cora and Lena Hewitt, 7 years old, identical dark hair, brown eyes, last seen at a roadside park outside Marfa with their mother, Liana, who had stepped 20 feet away to use the restroom. When she came back, the girls were gone. No witnesses. No vehicle description. No ransom call. The case had been worked hard for the first 18 months, then less hard, then put into a filing cabinet in Presidio County and visited only on anniversaries. Liana Hewitt had given up her job in El Paso to look for them. She had sold her car. She had slept in motels and in the back of a borrowed pickup. She had walked the shoulders of every back road between Marfa and Presidio with a stack of flyers and a sun-bleached photograph of two girls in matching yellow dresses. She had been on local television 4 times in the first year and twice in the second, and then not at all. By 2024, most people who'd followed the case assumed the girls were dead. Reese had read about it. He had thought briefly about how a mother survives something like that. Then he had gone on with his life, because that is what most men do. The bluff at the western edge of his lease was a long, pale ridge of limestone, roughly a mile and a half from his house, where the land began to climb toward the foothills. There were caves along its face, 3 large mouths he knew of, and probably a dozen smaller ones he didn't. Ranchers avoided the bluff. Cattle that wandered into the caves got disoriented in the dark, and sometimes never came back out. The county had talked about putting up fencing more than once, but never had. The terrain was bad. The wind off the foothills came hard in winter. Reese checked his fence line along that western boundary maybe twice a month, and he had never, in 15 years of leasing the land, dismounted to look inside any of the caves. There had been no reason to. That October morning was cold. He'd had coffee at 5:30, saddled Juno at 6, and ridden out into a still, gray dawn to push a small group of cows back from the western fence toward the main pasture. He was thinking about taxes. He was thinking about whether his daughter would come down for Thanksgiving. He was thinking about a leak in the barn roof that he'd been ignoring for 3 weeks. He was not thinking about anything important. Juno walked at her usual pace, head down, breath fogging in the cold. The cows complained but moved. The sun rose slowly over the mountains behind him. He had reached the base of the bluff by 7:15. And there, at the mouth of the largest cave, a wide, low opening that ran maybe 40 feet across and 12 feet high, the kind of natural shelter that mountain lions and bobcats sometimes used, Juno stopped. She did not slow. She did not hesitate. She planted her front hooves, locked her shoulders, and stopped moving entirely. Reese, half asleep in the saddle, almost pitched forward over her neck. He sat up. He clicked his tongue. He gave her a light tap with his heels. Nothing. He gave her a harder tap. Nothing. He said her name, the way he had said her name 10,000 times in 11 years. Low, easy, the same syllables in the same order, and she didn't even flick an ear. He looked down at her. Her nostrils were flared. Her ears were pinned flat against her skull. And then she let out a sound he had never heard from her in all the years he had owned her, a low, broken whicker, deep in her chest, the kind of sound a mare makes when she is trying to call something she cannot see. He sat very still. He looked at the cave mouth. The dark inside it was complete, the kind of dark that swallows light and gives nothing back. He told himself it was a mountain lion. He told himself it was a bear, even though there were no bears in Brewster County. He told himself it was nothing. He spurred her again, harder this time, harder than he had ever spurred her, and she did not move. She would not have moved if he had set her on fire. Reese Calloway dismounted slowly. His joints ached. His hands, when he set them on the saddle horn, were trembling, and he could not have told you why. He looped Juno's reins around a piece of mesquite, though he did not need to. She was not going anywhere, and he walked to the edge of the cave mouth and stopped. He listened. The wind moved over the top of the bluff. A red-tailed hawk called once, very far away. And then from somewhere inside the dark, somewhere down, somewhere deep, he heard it. It was a sound. A small, frayed sound that the wind almost took. It was not an animal. It was breath. It was the smallest possible piece of a human voice, and it was coming from inside the earth. He stood at the mouth of the cave, and his mouth went dry. He took one step in, and his boot scraped on loose rock, and the sound seemed to carry. He cleared his throat. He said hello, and his own voice came back to him off the walls, weak and stupid. He waited. He said it again. "Hello? Is somebody in there?" There was a long, terrible silence. Long enough that he almost convinced himself he had imagined the first sound. Long enough that he almost turned around and went back to Juneau and rode home and never spoke of it again. And then from somewhere in the dark, a voice answered. It was a girl's voice. It was thin and dry and barely formed, but it was a voice. And it said two words in Spanish. The way a child says a word she has been taught is the most important word in the world. Por favor. Reese Calloway felt his knees soften. He put one hand against the cold limestone wall of the cave to keep himself upright. He drew in a breath, and it shook on the way down, and he said, "I'm here. I'm here. I hear you. Can you say it again? Say it again, honey." And the voice, closer now, or maybe just clearer, or maybe just a little less afraid, said it in English. "We're scared. We're scared. We're scared." He didn't go in. Every instinct in him said go in, climb down, find them, but a deeper instinct, the kind that comes from 40 years of watching cattle in bad terrain, said no. He did not have a light. He did not have rope. He did not know what was down there with them. If he fell, no one would find any of them. He called into the dark, "I'm going to get help. I'm going to come back. I promise you. Stay where you are. Stay where you are." The voice did not answer. He waited. He called again. Nothing. He stood there for a full minute, listening, and then he turned and he ran. He ran to Juneau and threw himself into the saddle, and Juneau, who only seconds before had refused to take a single step, wheeled and went without being asked. She knew. She had always known. She ran flat out across the rough country, hooves striking limestone, and Reese, who had not pushed her like that in 5 years, did not slow her once. By the time they reached the gravel road that connected to the highway, her flanks were dark with sweat, and his hands were shaking too hard to hold the reins properly. He half fell out of the saddle at the truck. He grabbed the satellite phone out of the glove box. Cell coverage on the lease was a joke, and he dialed 911, and when the dispatcher answered he could not, for a long moment, make his mouth work. He finally said, "There's children. There's children in a cave on my lease. They're alive. Send everybody. Send everybody now." He did not sleep that night. He sat on his porch in a wool coat and watched the road, and at 3 in the morning the first set of headlights came up the long gravel drive, Brewster County Sheriff's vehicles, then Texas DPS, then a search and rescue truck out of Alpine. By dawn the western edge of the lease had 30 people on it. They went into the cave with helmets and lights and rope. They found the girls in a chamber 200 feet inside, down a sloped tunnel a grown man could barely fit through, in a small, hollowed-out space outfitted with a mattress, a chemical toilet, and a chain bolted into the rock. They were alive. They were 11 years old. They had been missing for 4 years. And they were maybe 2 days from being dead. Their names, of course, were Cora and Lena Hewitt. The man who had taken them was named Vernon Beck. He was 41 years old. He had been working as a ranch hand on a property 6 miles east of the bluff for the past 5 years, drifting from job to job before that, never staying anywhere long enough to be remembered. He had taken the girls from the roadside park in Marfa in October of 2020, in a green pickup truck no one had ever connected to him. He had kept them in that cave for 4 years. He had visited them at night, brought them food and water, kept them alive. And then, 3 weeks before Reese Calloway's horse refused to walk past the cave mouth, Vernon Beck had been pulled over on a county road outside Alpine with a blood alcohol level twice the legal limit. He had been booked into the Brewster County Jail. He had not been able to make bail. He had been sitting in a cell, watching the days pile up, knowing what was happening in that cave and saying nothing. The girls had gone 19 days without him. They had drunk the last of their water on day 15. By the morning Juno stopped on the trail, Cora and Lena Hewitt were sharing a single half-empty plastic bottle and waiting to die. The news broke in the afternoon, and by evening it was national. Press vans started rolling up the gravel road to the Callaway lease before sundown. The phone in the Adobe house, the phone Reese almost never used, would not stop ringing. Reporters from Dallas, from Houston, from El Paso. A producer from a morning show in New York. A woman from a magazine in Los Angeles. Reese gave one statement on the second day, standing in his own driveway in a clean shirt because his daughter had called and told him to put on a clean shirt. He said it once. He said it was my horse. She knew. That's all. Then he went back inside and he did not answer the door again. Vernon Beck was charged that week with kidnapping, false imprisonment, aggravated child endangerment, and 2 counts of attempted murder. Federal charges were added the following month. The girls were taken to the Children's Hospital in El Paso, where Leanna Hewitt was waiting in a hallway with no shoes on because she had not stopped to put any on when the call came. The reunion happened in a small room with the door closed and one nurse present. The nurse, when she spoke about it later, said only that she had never heard a sound like the sound Leanna Hewitt made when her daughters walked through that door. She said she hoped she never heard a sound like that again. The hospital let Reese visit briefly 3 days later. He drove the 4 hours from his lease in his old Ford. He bought a small bouquet of yellow flowers at a gas station outside Van Horn because he didn't know what else to bring. He sat in a waiting room for 45 minutes before they took him in. The girls were in the same room, in 2 beds pushed together. Cora was thinner. Lena had not spoken in 3 days. The doctors said she could speak, she just wouldn't. Liana stood when he walked in. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she walked across the room and she put her arms around him, and he, a tall, sun-cracked Texas cowboy who had not been hugged by a woman in 9 years, held very still because he did not know what else to do. When she stepped back, she said, "Thank you," and he said, "It was my horse, ma'am. It was my horse." And then very quietly from the bed by the window, Cora Hewitt, who had not seen a horse in 4 years, looked up at the nurse standing in the doorway and asked, in a voice that was barely a voice, "Where is the horse?" And her sister Lena, who had not spoken in 3 days, lifted her head off the pillow and asked the same thing. "Where is the horse?" Recovery was slow. The doctors used words like complex and long-term, and there were specialists, and there were therapists, and there were nights neither girl could sleep without all the lights on. Cora's legs had atrophied so badly she could not walk for 2 months. Lena had a deficiency that affected her vision. Both of them had teeth that needed work. Both of them, for a long time, would not eat unless the other one ate first. Liana lived in a small apartment near the hospital that a local church had paid the deposit on. She read to them every night. She slept in a chair between their beds. And in the 3rd week of their recovery, she called Reese Calloway, and she asked him if the girls could come and see his horse. The doctors approved a 1-day visit. Reese spent the better part of a week getting ready for it. He swept the barn until the floor shone. He laid down new straw. He bought a child-sized brush and a curry comb, and a soft halter that would not chafe a small hand. He filled the water trough twice, because the first time the water looked dusty to him. He did not, until the morning of, allow himself to admit that he was nervous. They arrived in a borrowed minivan, Liana, the girls, a nurse, a social worker. Cora came out in a wheelchair. Lena walked slowly, holding her mother's hand. Reese met them at the gate of the small corral. Juno was standing in the middle of it, in the patch of October sunlight, watching the visitors with the same calm, slow attention. She watched everything. Reese walked the girls in. Cora's wheelchair did not roll well over the dirt, so he and Liana carried it the last few feet. He stood the chair where the sun fell across Juno's flank. Juno turned her head. She looked at Cora. She looked at Lena. She walked slowly, the way an old horse walks when she does not want to startle anything, and she lowered her great pale head until her nose was an inch from Cora's hand. Cora, who had not initiated contact with another living thing in 4 years, lifted her fingers and touched the mare's nose. She did not cry. She did not laugh. She just kept her hand there. Lena walked around to the other side and pressed her cheek against the horse's neck, and her eyes closed, and she stood that way for a long time. They were with Juno for 3 hours. Lena, halfway through the second hour, slid down to the straw and fell asleep with her head against the mare's foreleg. Juno did not move. Juno stood there stock still for the entire length of that sleep. She did not shift her weight. She did not flick a fly. She stood the way she had stood at the cave mouth, like she had a job, and the job was to stay exactly where she was. Liana watched all of this from the rail. She did not speak. Reese did not speak either. There was nothing in that moment to say. 6 months passed. Cora began walking first with a frame, then with a cane, then on her own in slow, careful steps across the apartment floor. Lena began talking in full sentences, then in paragraphs, then in long, complicated stories she made up about animals on a faraway island. The therapists called the progress remarkable. Liana, who had spent 4 years sleeping in the back of a truck, sold what was left of her things in El Paso and moved to a small house in a small town 25 minutes from Reese's lease, where she took a job as a librarian, the first steady job she had held since 2020. The girls started visiting Juno on Saturdays. By the 3rd Saturday, Lena had ridden alone in the corral for the first time, Reese walking beside the mare with one hand on the saddle. By the 6th Saturday, Cora, who could not yet stand for more than 10 minutes, could sit upright on the horse for half an hour, while Reese led them in slow circles in the soft afternoon light. He bought a second horse for them, an old paint named Whistle, 22 years old, gentle as a worn glove, retired from a children's therapy program in Midland. He did not tell Liana what he had paid for the horse. He did not tell anyone. He cleared out the second stall and put down new boards on the floor. He taught the girls how to hold a brush, how to pick a hoof, how to read a horse's ears. He taught them slowly that animals tell you the truth about a place before people do. He did not say it like a lesson. He just said it in passing, the way an older man tells a younger one something he hopes will land. There were hard days, too. Days when Cora woke up screaming and would not be calmed for hours. Days when Lena, for no reason anyone could see, would not get out of the truck when they reached the ranch. There was an afternoon in March when a thunderstorm rolled in off the foothills and Lena heard the rain on the tin roof of the barn and froze where she stood and started to shake. The cave, the doctors had said, leaked when it rained, and the sound had become a sound she could not unhear. Reese, who had no training in any of this, did the only thing he could think of. He took her hand. He walked her over to Juno's stall. He set her palm flat against the mare's flank on the warm rise and fall of her side, and he said, "Listen. Listen to her breathing. Just listen to her breathing." And after a long minute, Lena's shaking slowed and her breath fell into the same rhythm as the horse's, and she said, very quietly, "Okay." She said it again. Okay. That was the word she had learned to use on the bad days to come back. The town, which had not known much about Reese Calloway before, came to know him by the slow, patient way he showed up at the diner with 2 small girls in tow on Saturday afternoons, by the way he carried Cora's wheelchair into the back of his Ford as if it weighed nothing, by the way the librarian, a soft-spoken woman with tired eyes and a slow, returning smile, looked at him across a table when she did not know he could see her. They organized a fund. Local businesses gave. A rancher 2 counties over donated a year's worth of hay. The Episcopal Church paid for new tires for Liana's car. Reese refused 3 separate times the formal reward the FBI offered for tips leading to the recovery of the girls. He refused the appearance fees offered by the morning shows. He refused a film deal. He accepted exactly one thing, a hand-tooled leather saddle, made by a craftsman in San Angelo, that Liana commissioned and saved for almost a year to pay for, with the name Juno stamped into the fender in clean black letters. He cried when she gave it to him. He did not let anyone see. A year and a half after that October morning, Cora Hewitt was 13 years old and reading veterinary textbooks at the kitchen table. She had told her mother, with the casual certainty of a child who has finally been allowed to want something, that she was going to be a horse doctor. Lena had grown 2 inches and was riding Juno confidently around the corral on her own, sitting straight and easy, her hands light on the reins, the way Reese had taught her. Liana worked at the library 4 days a week and helped Reese on the 5th, sorting his ranch correspondence, paying the bills he was terrible at remembering to pay, organizing 4 years of receipts into actual folders. They were not, by either of their accountings, in a relationship. They were, by everyone else's accounting, in something quieter and more durable than that. Vernon Beck pleaded guilty in the spring to avoid trial. He was sentenced to life, without the possibility of parole. He never spoke at sentencing. He never apologized. He never explained why he had done what he had done, and the families of the girls he had taken, and the investigators who had spent 4 years trying to find them, were left, as they often are, with the kind of silence that does not ever quite close. The cave on the western edge of Reese's lease was sealed by the county, concrete poured into the entrance, a heavy iron gate set into the rock above it, signage installed by a Forest Service crew. The bluff was quiet again. The cattle who had always avoided it continued to avoid it. Reese rode that fence line every 2 weeks, and sometimes when he did, he would stop Juno in the same patch of dust where she had stopped him that October morning, and he would sit there for a long minute, and he would lay one hand on her neck, and he would not say anything at all. Juno was retired from cattle work in her 16th year. She still had her stall. Reese still curried her every morning. She walked the girls around the corral on Saturdays, slow and steady and unhurried, and she stood for hours while small hands brushed her sides and small voices told her about school, and about the new puppy the librarian had finally given in and adopted, and about the science fair Cora had won with a project on equine respiratory systems. Whistle the old paint grazed in the next paddock and seemed content. The hand-tooled saddle hung on the wall of the tack room, and Reese looked at it every morning, and every morning he thought the same thing, which was that he had not done very much, really. He had just stayed in the saddle long enough to listen to a horse who knew more than he did. He had not been a hero, he thought. He had been a passenger. The hero had 4 legs and a star on her forehead, and a habit of standing very still when standing very still was the only right thing to do. On a still afternoon in late October, 2 years after the rescue, Liana and the girls drove out to the bluff. They brought a clay pot of yellow flowers, the same kind Reese had bought at that gas station outside Van Horn, and they planted them at the foot of the limestone wall, just outside the sealed cave. Cora knelt and patted the soil down with her own hands. Lena watered them from a plastic jug. Liana stood behind them with her arms crossed against the wind. Reese sat in the saddle on Juno, 10 feet back, the way he had been told to, close enough to be near, far enough to leave the moment to them. When they were done, Lena looked up at him and asked if she could ride home with him. He said yes. She climbed up in front of him in the saddle. Cora rode behind her mother in the truck. And Juno carried them, slow and patient, back down the trail toward home, past the spot where she had once refused to move, past the limestone bluff where 2 girls had once been buried alive, past the long, low October light that was the same light it had always been. The horse refused to walk past. The cowboy listened. Two girls came home.